There is a sound that has haunted the European imagination for more than 1,000 years. It begins as a whisper on the winter wind, so faint you might mistake it for the natural howling of a storm. But then it grows. It resolves itself into something unmistakable, something that sends a chill far deeper than any cold. It is the baying of hounds where there should be no hounds. It is the blast of hunting horns from the heart of a storm cloud. It is the thunder of hooves across a sky that should be empty. This is not the sound of the living world. This is the wild hunt. For centuries, across vast stretches of northern, western, and eastern Europe, people huddled in their homes during the darkest months of the year, listening to the wind and praying they would not hear that sound. Because to hear it, to witness the spectral cavalcade that produced it, was to stand at the threshold between life and death, between the mortal world and the realm of spirits. It was to receive a message, an omen of catastrophe delivered by riders who were themselves catastrophes given form. The wild hunt is one of the most widespread and enduring motifs in European folklore. In Germanic legends, it appears as the Wilde Jagd. The Scandinavians knew it as the Oskoreia, the Asgard ride. In Wales, it was the Cŵn Annwn, the hounds of the Otherworld. In England, it was Woden's hunt, or the devil's dandy dogs, or Gabriel's hounds. In Spain, the Estantiga. And in Italy, the Caccia Morta, the dead hunt. Each culture shaped the legend to fit its own landscape and cosmology, but the core remained constant. A spectral hunting party, led by a fearsome figure, racing through the night sky. A sight and sound that meant death, war, or ruin. This is not a story about monsters hiding under beds. This is a legend rooted in real terror, in the genuine anxieties of societies living at the mercy of forces they could not control or understand. The wild hunt emerges from a world where winter was not an inconvenience, but a siege, where darkness was absolute, where death walked close beside every hearth. To understand this legend, we must first understand the world that gave birth to it. A world where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was not a line, but a shadow, constantly shifting, always uncertain. To stand in a medieval village on a winter's night is to experience a darkness that the modern world has forgotten. There are no streetlights, no electric glow spilling from windows, no distant hum of traffic or aircraft. When the sun sets in December, the world is swallowed whole. The darkness is not merely an absence of light. It is a presence, a weight, a thing that presses against the walls and seeps through cracks in the shutters. It is total, suffocating, and in the hearts of those who lived through it, it was alive with possibility. In this world, winter was the season of confinement and dread. The fields were frozen into iron-hard furrows. The forests, once sources of game and firewood, became impassable labyrinths of snow and ice. Travel between settlements could mean death if a storm descended without warning. Every family retreated into their homes, small spaces heated by inadequate fires, filled with the smell of smoke and preserved food. The world shrank to the size of a single room, and beyond that room was an unknown that grew more menacing with each passing week. The anxiety was not abstract. It was written into the very structure of daily life. Every meal depleted the stores in the larder. Every day brought the possibility that the supplies would not last until spring. Starvation was not a distant horror. It was a neighbor's tragedy, a memory from the previous winter, a specter that haunted every calculation of how much bread to eat, how much salt, pork to ration. In communities that depended entirely on what they had managed to grow and preserve, there was no safety net. If the harvest had been poor, if the preservation had been inadequate, if the winter was longer than usual, people would die. It was that simple and that terrifying. This economic precariousness bred a particular kind of social pressure. In small, isolated communities, everyone knew everyone else's business. The gaze of neighbors became a constant, invisible presence, a force of social regulation that operated through gossip and judgment. A family that had been prudent and industrious, that had stored enough food and worked hard throughout the growing season, was seen as virtuous, reliable, a pillar of the community. But a family that was lazy, wasteful, or impious was not merely disappointing, they were dangerous. They were a future burden, mouths that might need to be fed from a collective store that might already be insufficient. In a world where survival depended on cooperation, to fail in your responsibilities was not just a personal failing, it was a threat to everyone. And so the winter nights became a time of scrutiny, of watching, of judging. Doors were locked, not just against the cold, but against the possibility of intrusion by those who had not prepared. Windows were shuttered not just to keep out the wind, but to keep in the light, to maintain the illusion of warmth and safety in a world that offered neither. The darkness outside was not empty. It was full of judgment, both human and otherwise. But the physical and economic terrors of winter were only part of the story. There was a third layer, a metaphysical dimension that transformed the season from merely dangerous into something profoundly uncanny. In the worldview of medieval and ancient Europe, the changing of the seasons was not simply a matter of weather. It was a cosmic event, a fundamental shift in the nature of reality itself. The sun's journey across the sky was not a predictable astronomical phenomenon. It was a daily battle, a struggle between order and chaos, light and darkness. And in winter, the sun was losing. This belief was not metaphorical, it was literal. The shortening days were evidence that the world itself was dying. The sun was weakening, withdrawing its life-giving warmth, abandoning humanity to the forces of cold and decay. And as the sun weakened, the barriers between the world of the living and the world of the dead grew thin and permeable. The winter solstice, the longest and darkest night of the year, was the moment of maximum danger, the point at which the veil was at its thinnest, and the gateways to the other world stood wide open. This was not folklore, this was cosmology. This was how the universe worked. During the deep midwinter, the dead could walk among the living. Spirits that had been confined to their own realm could wander freely into the lands of humankind. The forests, already forbidding, became highways for entities that were neither living nor dead, neither human nor animal, but something older, something that existed outside the categories of Christian theology. These were liminal times, sacred and dangerous periods that existed outside the normal flow of the calendar, when the usual laws of the universe were suspended. In this context, the precautions people took were not superstitious nonsense. They were practical survival strategies. Doors were barred and windows shuttered not just to keep out the cold, but to keep out the spirits. To travel at night during the midwinter season was not merely risky. It was suicidal, an invitation to encounter forces beyond human comprehension. Offerings were left at thresholds and crossroads, not as quaint traditions but as negotiations, attempts to appease or placate the powers that roamed the darkness. The hearth fire was kept burning not just for warmth but as a sacred protective center, a beacon of life and light in a world increasingly dominated by death and shadow. And into this world of fear, isolation, and supernatural possibility came the sound of the hunt. The howling of the wind resolved itself into the baying of spectral hounds. The crack of thunder became the gallop of phantom horses. The darkness took shape and form, becoming riders on black steeds, warriors and spirits racing across the sky. The wild hunt was not an intrusion into a peaceful world. It was the confirmation of every anxiety, the materialization of every fear. It was the darkness given voice, the supernatural given form. It was, in a very real sense, the sound of winter itself. If you trace the roots of the wild hunt back through the tangled undergrowth of European folklore, you will eventually find yourself standing at the foot of a great ash tree, looking up into branches that reach beyond the sky into other worlds entirely. This is Yggdrasil, the world tree of Norse mythology, and somewhere in its vast crown, Riding on winds that blow between the realms of gods and men, you will find him, the All-Father, the one-eyed wanderer, Odin. Odin, known as Wotan to the Germanic tribes and Woden to the Anglo-Saxons, is the figure most commonly associated with the wild hunt in its oldest and most powerful forms. But he is not a simple deity. He is not the benevolent, white-bearded father figure of later mythology. He is complex, contradictory, and profoundly dangerous. He is the god of wisdom, but his wisdom was bought with sacrifice, with pain, with the surrender of an eye into the depths of Mimir's well. He is the god of poetry, but also the god of war. He is the patron of kings, but also of outlaws. He is the god who brings victory, but also the god who chooses which warriors will die in battle. He is order and chaos, light and shadow, bound together in a single, paradoxical figure. This complexity is essential to understanding his role in the wild hunt. He is a psychopomp, a conductor of souls, a deity whose primary function is to stand at the boundary between life and death and determine who crosses over. In Norse mythology, warriors who died in battle did not simply expire. They were chosen. Half were selected by the Valkyries, the fierce maidens who served Odin, to join him in Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. There they would feast and fight, preparing for the final battle at the end of the world. The other half went to the goddess Freya, to her hall in Folkvanger. But the selection process, the moment of death, the choice of who would be honored and who would be forgotten, all of this was Odin's domain. This is why the wild hunt, in its original Norse and Germanic context, is fundamentally a procession of the honored dead. The Einherjar, Odin's chosen warriors, follow their lord across the sky, engaged in an eternal hunt. They are not damned souls, they are heroes. They ride not in punishment but in glory, their spectral forms a testament to their valor. The sound of the hunt is the sound of their celebration, the thunder of their passage, a reminder that death in battle is not an ending but a transformation, an elevation to a higher plane of existence. But there is another aspect to Odin that makes him the perfect leader of the wild hunt. He is the god of ecstasy, of divine madness, of a state called order in Old Norse. This word translates imperfectly as fury, inspiration, frenzy, and possession all at once. It describes a mental and spiritual state in which the boundaries of the self dissolve, in which a person becomes a conduit for forces beyond human control. The berserkers, those legendary warriors who fought in trances of uncontrollable rage, were Odin's special devotees. They entered battle not as mere soldiers but as living conduits of the god's fury, their minds and bodies no longer entirely their own. The wild hunt is this divine frenzy made visible. It is order writ large across the winter landscape. It is chaos, pure and untamable, racing across the night sky. It is the storm not as a natural phenomenon, but as an expression of divine rage. The howling of the wind is Odin's battle cry. The violence of the blizzard is the fury of his berserkers, unleashed upon the world. The hunt operates entirely outside the bounds of human law and reason. It follows no rules. It respects no boundaries. It is the raw, primal force of nature and divinity combined. This understanding of the hunt as a manifestation of divine madness explains why encountering it was so terrifying. It was not merely that the riders were ghosts or spirits. It was that they represented a force fundamentally incompatible with ordinary human existence. To see the wild hunt was to witness the gods themselves, unfiltered and undiluted, in a form that the human mind was not equipped to process. It was to stand too close to the sun, to gaze into the abyss and find that the abyss was looking back. Those who survived such encounters were often said to lose their sanity, their minds broken by the proximity to such overwhelming power. The hunt rode primarily during the midwinter period, the time of Yule, when Odin was known by his winter titles, Yolnir and Yalohera, both meaning master of Yule. This was the sacred season, the time when the boundaries between worlds were at their thinnest, when the gods walked closest to the earth. It was the time when offerings were made, when rituals were performed, when the old powers demanded recognition and respect. The hunt was part of this complex web of belief and practice. It was a visitation, a reminder that the gods had not abandoned humanity, but also that they were not benevolent shepherds. They were wild, unpredictable, and ultimately indifferent to human suffering. This original context, this understanding of the wild hunt as a procession of divine warriors led by a god of death and madness, is crucial. It explains the hunt's power, its persistence, and its evolution. When Christianity arrived in Northern Europe, it could not simply erase Odin. He was too deeply embedded in the cultural memory, too essential to the way people understood the world. Instead, he was transformed. The god became a demon. The divine madness became diabolical possession. The honored dead became the damned. The wild hunt went from a sacred procession to a hellish cavalcade. But the core remained. The sound of hooves in the storm, the baying of hounds in the darkness, the sense that something vast and terrible was moving through the night, something that belonged to a time before churches and crosses, something that would outlast them both. Odin became Woden, and Woden became a figure of folklore rather than worship. But the wild hunt continued to ride. It rode through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. It rode into the Age of Enlightenment and beyond. And at its head, whether acknowledged or not, was still the one-eyed wanderer, the god who had sacrificed so much for wisdom, who now rode eternally through the winter sky, gathering souls and hunting prey that no mortal eye could see. In the year 1127, something happened in England that was deemed significant enough to record in one of the most important historical documents of the Anglo-Saxon period. The Peterborough Chronicle, a continuation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle maintained by monks at Peterborough Abbey, contains an entry for that year that stands out among the usual records of kings and battles and ecclesiastical appointments. It describes, in careful and sober detail, an encounter with something that should not exist, an encounter with the wild hunt. The context is important. In February of 1127, King Henry I of England had forced upon Peterborough Abbey a new abbot, Henry of Poitou, also known as Henry d'Angely. This man was already the abbot of Saint Jean d'Angely in France, and his appointment to Peterborough was widely seen as illegitimate, a violation of the proper procedures for selecting monastic leaders. The monks of Peterborough were not pleased. The chronicler who recorded the events of that year makes his feelings clear, describing the abbot as someone who did nothing good and left nothing good, extracting wealth and sending it overseas. Of his exit, the chronicler notes, "We cannot yet say," a thinly veiled hope that the man would not last long. And then, in the immediate aftermath of this unwelcome appointment, the wild hunt appeared. The chronicler writes, "Let no one be surprised at what we are about to relate, for it was common gossip up and down the countryside." He is careful to establish that this is not merely his own observation, but a widely reported phenomenon, attested to by multiple witnesses. It was the Sunday after the abbot's arrival, the day they sang a particular liturgical text, when many people both saw and heard a great number of huntsmen hunting. The description that follows is precise and deeply unsettling. The huntsmen were black, huge, and hideous. They rode on black horses and on black he-goats. Their hounds were jet black, with eyes like saucers, and horrible. This was seen in the very deer park of the town of Peterborough, and in all the woods that stretch from that same town to Stamford. Not a fleeting glimpse, not a single isolated incident, but a sustained manifestation that covered a significant geographic area. The monks heard them sounding and winding their horns all through the night. Reliable witnesses who kept watch declared that there might well have been 20 or even 30 hornblowers, as near as they could tell. The chronicler adds that this was seen and heard from when Henry of Poitou came there, all through Lenten tide right up to Easter. This sustained supernatural event, lasting weeks, coincided precisely with the arrival of the unwanted abbot. The chronicler's interpretation is clear. This was an omen, a sign from the other world that something was deeply wrong. The land itself was rising up in protest against the unnatural appointment. The hunt was a message, a warning, a manifestation of divine or cosmic displeasure. Modern scholars have suggested that the monks may have been engaging in a form of political commentary, using the folklore of the wild hunt to express their outrage in a way that could not be punished by secular authorities. After all, they were merely recording what many people had witnessed. They were not themselves criticizing the king's decision. They were simply noting that the spirits had done so. But whether the monks believed literally in the wild hunt or were using it as a rhetorical device, the account itself is extraordinary. It is one of the earliest and most detailed written descriptions of the phenomenon, and it demonstrates that by the 12th century, the wild hunt was a well-established part of the cultural landscape of England. It was something people expected to see under certain circumstances, something that had a recognized form and meaning, something that could be invoked to explain or comment upon events in the mortal world. The Peterborough account is not unique. Throughout medieval chronicles and ecclesiastical writings, there are scattered references to similar manifestations. In 1091, the Norman historian Orderic Vitalis recorded a story from France about a priest named Walchelin who encountered a vast army of the dead, led by a giant with a club, marching along a road at night. The priest recognized among the specters people who had recently died, including knights, clergy, and women. The procession was described as the household of Hellequin, the Maisnie Hellequin, a French variant of the wild hunt. The priest survived the encounter but was marked by it, his life changed by the proximity to such overwhelming supernatural power. Similar accounts appear across Europe. In some, the hunt is heard but not seen, only the sound of horns and hounds echoing through the night. In others, it is a full visual spectacle, a cavalcade of horsemen and beasts racing across the sky or along forest paths. In some accounts, the riders are clearly identified as the dead. In others, they are demons or fairies or spirits of nature, but the core elements remain consistent. The hunt appears at night, primarily in winter. It is loud, chaotic, and terrifying. It is associated with significant events, often negative ones, wars, plagues, deaths, or political upheavals. And to witness it is to stand at the threshold between worlds, to see something that mortal eyes are not meant to see. These written records are invaluable because they give us a window into how educated, literate people, usually monks or clergy, understood and described the wild hunt. They show that it was not merely a peasant superstition but a phenomenon that crossed class boundaries, that was taken seriously even by those who had the education to know better. The fact that these accounts appear in formal chronicles, documents intended to record factual history, suggests that the witnesses genuinely believed they had experienced something real, something beyond the normal run of human experience. And perhaps most tellingly, these accounts show that the wild hunt was not a static legend. It evolved and adapted to changing circumstances. In the Peterborough account, the hunt is clearly functioning as an omen of political illegitimacy. In the French accounts, it becomes associated with the souls of the recently dead, a belief that would persist and develop throughout the medieval period. Different regions emphasized different aspects. Some focused on the role of the hunt as a gatherer of souls. Others emphasized its prophetic function, its role as a harbinger of disaster. Still others saw it as a manifestation of divine judgment or demonic activity. But through all these variations, the fundamental terror remained. The wild hunt was a rupture in the fabric of reality, a moment when the other world broke through into this one, bringing with it all the chaos and dread that lay on the far side of death. To hear it was to know, with absolute certainty, that the world was larger and stranger and more dangerous than daylight would suggest. It was to be reminded that winter was not merely a season but a siege, and that in the darkness beyond the fire, ancient powers still held sway. The figure at the head of the wild hunt, whether Odin or another, is terrifying enough, but he does not ride alone. Behind him, following in his wake, stretching back into the storm until they fade into shadow and sound, is the host. The riders who make up the bulk of the hunt are as important to the legend as the leader himself, and their identity reveals much about what the wild hunt meant to those who feared it. In the original Norse and Germanic tradition, the host was composed of the Einherjar, Odin's chosen warriors. These were the souls of men who had died gloriously in battle and had been selected to join the god in Valhalla. They were not ghosts in the modern sense, not pale remnants or echoes of life. They were elevated, transformed, made more than they had been in life. They rode with Odin as his personal army, engaged in an eternal hunt and an eternal battle, preparing for the final conflict at the end of the world. To see them was to witness the reward of a warrior's death, the proof that glory and honor transcended mortality. But as Christianity spread across Northern Europe, this understanding changed. The church could not tolerate the idea of pagan heroes riding in triumph across the sky. The Einherjar had to be reinterpreted, redefined, transformed from heroes into something else. And so, they became the damned. The host became a procession of lost souls, not elevated by death, but condemned by it, forced to ride eternally, not as a reward, but as a punishment. Odin, the divine leader, became a demonic one, and his followers became the souls of sinners, trapped in an endless, futile chase. This Christian reinterpretation introduced a new element to the host's identity. They were no longer just the war dead. They were the restless dead, souls who for various reasons could not find peace in the afterlife. This included those who had died violently, victims of murder or execution. It included suicides, whose souls were believed to be in a particularly dangerous state, neither fully dead nor able to move on. It included women who had died in childbirth, a tragically common occurrence that was seen as a death before one's time, leaving the soul in a state of limbo. It included the unbaptized, especially infants, who, according to church doctrine, could not enter heaven without the sacrament and were therefore trapped in an eternal in-between state. These souls were not riding by choice. They had been swept up, caught by the wild hunt in its passage, and forced to join its eternal procession. This introduced a new element of horror to the legend. The hunt was not merely a manifestation of the supernatural. It was actively predatory. It sought to capture souls, to add them to its number. And the mechanism of capture was terrifyingly simple. If you saw the wild hunt, if you looked directly at it, if you cried out or called to the riders, your soul could be pulled from your body. You would be dragged into the sky, forced to join the furious host, condemned to ride with them until the end of time. This belief explains the elaborate precautions people took when they heard the hunt approaching. The most important rule was to hide. If you were outdoors when the hunt passed, you were to throw yourself to the ground immediately, face down, and cling to anything rooted in the earth, a tree, a bush, a tuft of grass. You were to cover your face, close your eyes, and absolutely, under no circumstances, look up. The hunt could not take you if you did not see it, if you did not acknowledge its presence. The earth would protect you. The living world would shield you from the dead one, but only if you remained absolutely still and silent. If you were indoors, you were to bar the door and shutter the windows. You were to cover any mirrors, as reflective surfaces were believed to be portals through which spirits could pass. You were to keep the hearth fire burning as fire was a barrier against the supernatural. And you were to be silent. No matter what sounds you heard outside, no matter how much the wind howled or the hounds bayed, you were not to speak, not to call out, not to respond in any way. The hunt was a test of nerve, a trial of will. Those who maintained their discipline, who resisted the urge to look or speak, would survive. Those who faltered would be lost. In regions with strong Celtic influence, particularly in Britain, Ireland, and parts of France, the identity of the host took on a different character. Here, the riders were often identified not as the Christian dead, but as the fair folk, the fairies, the elves of ancient tradition. But these were not the diminutive, benevolent creatures of later Victorian fancy. These were the original elves, the Aussie of Irish tradition, the Tylwyth Teg of Wales, powerful, amoral, and deeply dangerous beings who inhabited a parallel world that existed alongside the human one. In this interpretation, the Wild Hunt was the procession of the fairy aristocracy, the nobles of the Otherworld riding out on a royal hunt. Their passage through the mortal world was a reminder that humanity's domain was built on top of a much older landscape, one that the fair folk had never fully relinquished. The hunt could be benevolent or malevolent depending on the circumstances. Those who showed proper respect, who left offerings at the right places, and observed the correct rituals, might receive gifts or protection. But those who offended the fair folk, who trespassed on their sacred places or violated their taboos, could be taken. And to be taken by the fairies was to be removed from the mortal world entirely, transported to the Otherworld, lost to human society forever. This fairy interpretation of the host provided a supernatural explanation for one of the most tragic and common occurrences in pre-modern life. When a person, particularly a child, vanished without a trace in the wilderness, especially during winter, they were said to have been taken by the hunt or stolen by the fairies. This narrative provided a form of terrible closure. It transformed a random tragedy, a death with no body and no explanation, into an act of mythic significance. The child was not simply dead. They were elsewhere, in another world, among the fair folk. It was no comfort, but it was something. It was a story that could be told, a way of making sense of the senseless. Whether the host was composed of the damned dead or the fairy folk, or some combination of both, the core concept remained the same. The Wild Hunt represented a population of beings who existed outside the bounds of the Christian world and its promise of salvation. They were the lost, the other, the unclaimed. They were everyone and everything that did not fit into the neat categories of heaven and hell, saint and sinner, saved and damned. They were the reminder that the universe was larger and stranger than any theology could encompass, that beyond the light of the church there were powers that answered to older laws, followed older rules, and cared nothing for human prayers or human virtue. And they were growing. With every passage, with every ride, the host could capture new souls, adding them to its number. The Wild Hunt was not static. It was accumulating, gathering strength, becoming more and more a force that could overwhelm the human world. This made it not just a terror but an existential threat, a gathering darkness that might one day swallow everything. The only protection was vigilance, discipline, and faith. Whether in the Christian God or in the older rituals and practices that predated the church, the hunt would ride, that was certain. Whether you survived its passage depended on how well you understood its rules and how carefully you followed them. While the Germanic traditions of Northern and Central Europe provided the foundation for the Wild Hunt legend, the Celtic lands, particularly Wales, Ireland, and Scotland, developed their own distinct versions of the myth. These variations were not mere copies of the German wild Jagd. They were organic expressions of a different cultural landscape, shaped by different gods, different cosmologies, and different understandings of the relationship between the living and the dead. In Welsh mythology, the leader of the hunt was not Odin but Cŵn Annwn, a figure whose name translates as Gwyn, son of Nud, or white son of Nud, though he is paradoxically often described as having a blackened face. Gwyn was the king of Annwn, the Welsh Otherworld, a realm that was not the Christian hell but rather a place of eternal youth, abundance, and beauty, where the usual rules of time and mortality did not apply. Annwn was the land of the fairies, the Tylwyth Teg, and Gwyn ruled over them as their sovereign lord. But Gwyn was not merely a fairy king. He was also a psychopomp, a guide of souls, responsible for escorting the dead from the mortal world to the other world. This dual role, lord of the fairies and shepherd of the dead, made him a figure of immense power and complexity. He stood at the boundary between life and death, between the human world and the realm of spirits, and his presence in either domain signaled a thinning of the barriers that normally kept them separate. Gwyn's hunt was accompanied by the Cŵn Annwn, the hounds of Annwn, spectral dogs that were among the most distinctive and terrifying elements of the Welsh tradition. These were not ordinary dogs. They were white-bodied with red ears, a color combination that in Celtic symbolism was deeply significant. White was the color of the supernatural, the otherworldly, the domain of spirits and gods. Red was the color of death, of blood, of the boundary between life and the ending of life. The Cŵn Annwn were living emblems of this boundary, creatures that belonged fully to neither the world of the living nor the world of the dead, but to the liminal space between. The sound was distinctive and deeply unnerving. Their baying had a peculiar quality. It was loudest when the hounds were at a great distance and grew softer and softer as they approached. This reversal of normal acoustic behavior made them profoundly disorienting. You could never be sure how close they were, whether the distant baying meant they were miles away or right behind you. This uncertainty added an extra layer of psychological terror to encounters with the hunt. You could not judge your danger by the usual sensory cues. The world had become unreliable, deceptive, governed by rules that contradicted common experience. To hear the howling of the Cŵn Annwn was an omen of death. Not necessarily your own death, though that was a possibility, but death within your family or community. The hounds were hunting souls, tracking those who were marked for passage from this world to the next. Their prey were wrongdoers, those who had committed crimes or moral failings serious enough to warrant supernatural attention. The hunt would chase these individuals relentlessly, running them into the ground until they could flee no further, forcing them to confront their guilt and accept their fate. But the Welsh tradition, like the Germanic one, contained ambiguity. Cŵn Annwn was not purely malevolent. He was performing a necessary function, maintaining the balance between worlds, shepherding souls who needed to make the journey. In some tales, he was even depicted as noble, a king fulfilling his sacred duties. The medieval cleric Walter Map, writing in the late 12th century, included accounts that could be interpreted as presenting otherworldly figures in a more courteous light, suggesting a complexity in how these entities were understood. This more nuanced portrayal existed alongside the darker tales of the hunt, creating a complex portrait of a figure who could be both protector and predator, depending on the circumstances and the character of those who encountered him. The Irish tradition offered yet another variation. Here, the leader was sometimes identified as Fionn mac Cumhaill, the legendary warrior and leader of the Fianna, or as Manannán mac Lir, the god of the sea and the otherworld. But more commonly, the hunt was simply the ride of the Sídhe, the fairy folk themselves, without a single clearly defined leader. The Sídhe were understood to be the descendants or transformed remnants of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the divine race that had ruled Ireland before the arrival of the Giles. When the human Gaels conquered Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann retreated into the Hollow Hills, the ancient burial mounds that dotted the landscape, where they lived in magnificent halls, invisible to mortal eyes. From these hidden realms, the Sidhe would occasionally emerge, and their processions were both beautiful and terrifying. They traveled by night, moving from one fairy mound to another, and woe to any mortal who found themselves in their path. The Sidhe were intensely territorial. To stumble into their procession was to commit an intrusion, and the punishment could be severe. You might be struck blind or lame, you might be driven mad, or you might be taken, carried off to the Otherworld, replaced in the mortal world by a changeling, a fairy substitute left to live your life while you dwelt among the Sidhe. The Irish tradition emphasized the danger of liminal times and places. The hunt rode most often at Samhain, the festival that marked the end of autumn and the beginning of winter, when the barriers between worlds were at their thinnest. It favored crossroads, boundaries between fields, thresholds of all kinds, places that were neither fully one thing nor another. To be at such a place at such a time was to stand in a zone of maximum supernatural danger, where the rules of the mortal world no longer fully applied. But the Irish tales also contained moments of wonder. Those who encountered the Sidhe procession and showed proper respect, who stepped aside and averted their eyes and spoke the correct ritual phrases, might be rewarded. They might find fairy gold, though it would turn to leaves by morning. They might receive knowledge, a glimpse of the future, or insight into hidden things. They might even be invited to join the feast, though accepting fairy food was always dangerous, as it could bind you to the Otherworld permanently. The Scottish Highlands developed their own distinct version of the hunt, blending elements of both Irish and Norse traditions. Here, the hunt was associated with the Sluagh, the host of the unforgiven dead, souls who had died in a state of sin and were now condemned to wander the earth. The Sluagh flew through the air in great flocks, like birds, always traveling from west to east, and they were said to attempt to enter homes through west-facing windows to carry off the souls of the dying. To protect against the Sluagh, Highlanders would keep west-facing windows tightly shuttered, especially when someone in the household was gravely ill. They would also recite protective prayers and blessings, asking for divine intervention to keep the host at bay. The Sluagh were seen as irredeemably evil, unlike the more morally ambiguous fairy folk of Irish tradition. They were the damned, and their purpose was to increase their numbers by taking others with them into damnation. What all of these Celtic variations share is a sense of the Otherworld as a place that exists in parallel to the mortal world, separated by a boundary that is permeable, especially at certain times and places. The wild hunt, in all its forms, is a moment when that boundary weakens or dissolves entirely, allowing the inhabitants of the Otherworld to cross over into the realm of the living. Whether they are fairies, gods, or the restless dead, their appearance is a disruption of the natural order, a breach in the wall between what is and what should not be. The Celtic traditions also emphasize reciprocity and respect. Unlike the Germanic tradition, where the hunt is primarily something to be feared and hidden from, the Celtic tales suggest that proper behavior, correct ritual observance, and appropriate respect can transform a potentially deadly encounter into something benign or even beneficial. The Otherworld is dangerous, but it is not arbitrary. It operates according to rules, and those who understand and follow those rules can navigate its dangers. This difference reflects broader cultural attitudes. The Germanic worldview, shaped by centuries of harsh winters and constant warfare, tended toward a more fatalistic outlook. The gods were powerful but capricious. The world was fundamentally hostile. Survival depended on strength, courage, and acceptance of one's fate. The Celtic worldview, while certainly not naive about the dangers of existence, placed greater emphasis on knowledge, poetry, and the power of words. The Celts believed that understanding the true names of things, knowing the correct formulas and rituals, could give you power over even the most dangerous supernatural forces. Both traditions, however, agreed on one fundamental point: the wild hunt was real. It was not a metaphor or a superstition. It was a phenomenon that occurred in the world, something that could be experienced directly, something that demanded response and respect. And both traditions passed down elaborate instructions for surviving an encounter, a body of practical knowledge that was as important as knowing how to plant crops or cure illness. The wild hunt was part of the fabric of reality, and knowing how to navigate it was part of the essential knowledge required to survive in a world that was far stranger and more dangerous than it appeared in the daylight. The wild hunt was never merely a spectacle, never simply a frightening sight to be endured and then forgotten. It was a message. Every appearance carried meaning, and those who witnessed it or heard its passage were expected to decode that meaning, to understand what the other world was trying to communicate to the living. The hunt was a form of prophecy, a supernatural announcement system that broadcast warnings of impending catastrophe to those who had the knowledge to interpret its signs. The most common interpretation of the hunt's appearance was as a portent of war. When the spectral army rode through the sky, it meant that a terrestrial army would soon march upon the earth. The connection was not subtle or metaphorical. It was direct and literal. The supernatural world was reflecting, or perhaps causing, events in the mortal world. The violence of the hunt presaged violence among humanity. The chaos of the spectral riders would soon be mirrored by the chaos of battle, siege, and conquest. This belief was rooted in a particular understanding of how the universe worked. In the pre-modern worldview, the cosmos was not divided into separate, independent spheres. The heavens, the earth, and the underworld were all interconnected, all part of a single, unified system. What happened in one realm had consequences in the others. The movements of the stars influenced events on Earth. The moral state of humanity affected the natural world, bringing drought or plenty, pestilence or health. And the appearance of supernatural phenomena in the sky was a direct reflection of coming events in human affairs. The wild hunt, as a manifestation of the supernatural in the mortal world, was one of the most powerful of these signs. It was the universe itself making an announcement, sending a clear and terrifying signal that the fabric of reality was about to be torn, that the normal order of things was about to be disrupted. War was the most obvious and common interpretation because war was the most common catastrophic disruption of medieval life. It brought death, destruction, famine, and disease. It tore apart communities and destroyed the careful work of years in a matter of weeks. To know that war was coming was to know that everything you had built might soon be ashes. But war was not the only disaster the hunt could herald. It was also associated with the death of kings and great nobles. The passing of a monarch was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a moment of profound instability for the entire realm. Succession crises could lead to civil war. The death of a strong king could invite invasion from neighboring powers. The very structure of society depended on the person of the ruler, and when that person died, especially if the death was sudden or unexpected, the consequences could be catastrophic. The wild hunt's appearance before the death of a king was understood as the supernatural world preparing to receive a soul of great importance. Odin, as the chooser of the slain, was coming to claim another great warrior or leader for his hall. The hunt was the procession that would escort the soul from the mortal world to the afterlife, and its early arrival was a sign that the moment of transition was near. Those who witnessed the hunt before a royal death were seeing the mechanism of fate itself, the gears of destiny turning to bring about a preordained end. The third great disaster associated with the wild hunt was plague. In a world without germ theory, epidemic disease was understood as a supernatural phenomenon, a curse or punishment sent by God or unleashed by malevolent spirits. The sudden appearance of a sickness that killed indiscriminately, that swept through communities and decimated populations, could only be explained as an act of otherworldly power. And the wild hunt, as a manifestation of death itself, was naturally associated with these outbreaks. The hunt was said to carry plague on its breath. The spectral riders exhaled pestilence. The wind that accompanied their passage was infected, poisonous, capable of bringing disease to anyone who breathed it. To see the hunt pass over your village or town was to know that death would soon visit, that the sickness would come, that many would not survive the winter. This belief added an extra layer of terror to encounters with the hunt. It was not merely that you might be captured and dragged away. It was that simply being near the hunt, simply existing in the same space it had occupied, could doom you and everyone you knew. These three disasters, war, the death of rulers, and plague, were not random associations. They were the three horsemen of the apocalypse, the three great catastrophes that defined life in medieval Europe. They were the events that communities feared most, the disruptions that could destroy everything. And the wild hunt, by serving as an omen of these disasters, became the ultimate symbol of impending doom, the sign that everything was about to go wrong. But the prophetic function of the hunt served a deeper psychological purpose than merely terrifying people. It provided a framework for understanding and responding to catastrophe. A random disaster, an event that comes without warning and for no reason, is a profoundly nihilistic experience. It suggests that the universe is meaningless, that human life has no significance, that we are nothing more than dust blown by uncaring winds. But a disaster that has been announced, that has been heralded by a great omen, is part of a story. It is part of a cosmic drama in which humanity plays a role. The wild hunt transformed senseless tragedy into meaningful narrative. It suggested that the affairs of humanity were so important that they were reflected in the heavens, that the gods or spirits or whatever powers governed the universe were paying attention, were invested in what happened to mortal communities. Yes, terrible things were coming, but they were coming as part of a larger pattern, a greater story. They were not random, they were significant. This belief also provided a sense of agency, however small. If the hunt was a warning, then there was time, however brief, to prepare. Communities could stockpile food, repair fortifications, make peace with enemies, or undertake rituals and prayers to appease whatever powers had sent the warning. The hunt gave people something to do in the face of impending disaster, a way to assert some measure of control over their fate. It transformed passive victims into active participants in their own survival. The historical accounts of the hunt support this interpretation. The 1127 Peterborough Chronicle entry explicitly connects the appearance of the hunt to political turmoil, the illegitimate appointment of an abbot, and the troubles that followed. The account by Orderic Vitalis links the hunt to the souls of the recently dead and the need for prayers and masses to speed them on their way. These are not stories about random supernatural encounters. They are stories about signs and meanings, about the universe communicating with humanity through the language of the extraordinary. Over time, different regions developed their own specific interpretations of what the hunt meant. In some areas, to hear the hunt was specifically an omen of your own death within the year. In others, it meant death in the family, but not necessarily your own. In still others, the hunt's meaning depended on the direction it traveled or the time of night it appeared. These variations show communities actively working to understand and categorize their experiences, to build up a body of interpretive knowledge that could be passed down and used to navigate future encounters. The wild hunt, as an omen, was part of a much larger system of prophetic signs that governed pre-modern life. Comets, eclipses, strange weather, the behavior of animals, dreams, all of these were read as messages from the supernatural world about events to come. The hunt was simply the most dramatic and unambiguous of these signs. It could not be missed. It could not be misinterpreted. When the spectral riders galloped across the sky, everyone knew that something momentous was about to happen. The only question was what, and to whom, and how soon. This prophetic dimension of the hunt also helps explain its persistence. Even as Christianity worked to demonize the old gods, and even as the Enlightenment worked to rationalize the universe, the hunt continued to appear in folklore and in reported sightings because it continued to serve this essential psychological function. It gave people a way to frame and understand the catastrophes that periodically devastated their communities. It was a story that made sense of senselessness, that imposed order on chaos, and in a world that often seemed random and cruel, that was a story worth preserving, worth believing, worth passing down to the next generation as essential wisdom about how the universe actually worked. When Christianity swept across Europe, it brought with it not just a new religion, but an entirely new cosmology. The universe, according to Christian theology, was not a collection of competing powers and ambiguous spirits. It was a strict hierarchy with God at the top, angels serving him, humanity in the middle, and demons, led by Satan, at the bottom. There was no room in this system for the morally ambiguous entities of pagan belief, no place for nature spirits who were neither good nor evil, no tolerance for gods who could be both creative and destructive, both helpful and harmful. The church faced a significant problem with figures like Odin and the wild hunt. These beliefs were too deeply embedded in the cultural consciousness to simply disappear. People had been telling stories about the hunt for generations, had been taking precautions against it, had been interpreting its appearances as omens for longer than anyone could remember. The church could not simply declare that none of it had ever been real. That would have made Christianity appear ignorant of the world as people actually experienced it. Instead, the church needed to reinterpret these phenomena, to fit them into the Christian framework, to transform them from pagan beliefs into Christian truths. The primary strategy was demonization. Odin, the Allfather, the god of wisdom and death, was recast as a demon, a servant of Satan. His divine status was stripped away. He became Woden the devil, a fallen angel or powerful demon who had deceived the ancient pagans into worshipping him as a god. The wild hunt, which had been his sacred procession, became a hellish cavalcade, a parade of the damned led by a diabolical figure. The Einherjar, the honored dead, became lost souls, sinners being punished for their wickedness. This transformation was thorough and systematic. Church authorities preached against the hunt, identifying it as a manifestation of demonic power. To witness the hunt was to witness the forces of evil at work in the world. To participate in any ritual or practice associated with the hunt was to engage in devil worship, a mortal sin that would lead to damnation. The hunt went from being a sacred mystery, a manifestation of divine power that demanded respect and awe, to being an evil to be opposed, resisted, and feared for entirely different reasons. But interestingly, the church did not deny the reality of the hunt. It could not. Too many people had witnessed it, or knew people who had. Instead, the church confirmed its existence while changing its meaning. Yes, the wild riders still galloped across the sky. Yes, you could still hear the hounds and the horns. But these were not gods or honored ancestors. They were demons and damned souls, manifestations of the punishment that awaited sinners in the afterlife. The hunt became a tool of evangelization, a vivid demonstration of what happened to those who rejected Christian teaching. This reinterpretation had a powerful effect. It took a phenomenon that had inspired awe and transformed it into something that inspired fear and shame. To admit to having seen the hunt was no longer a claim to have witnessed something sacred. It was an admission of being close to evil, of having been exposed to demonic influence. People who might once have spoken openly about their encounters now kept silent, afraid of being accused of witchcraft or heresy. The transformation of the hunt's followers was particularly significant. In the pagan understanding, the host included many different kinds of beings: warriors, nature spirits, fairies, the restless dead. The church collapsed all of these categories into a single identity, the damned. Anyone riding with the hunt was a sinner being punished, a soul that had rejected God's grace and was now suffering the consequences. This simplified the moral landscape dramatically. There was no longer any ambiguity, no need to determine whether a particular spirit was benevolent or malevolent, helpful or harmful. If it rode with the hunt, it was evil, and that was all anyone needed to know. This demonization also changed the nature of protective rituals. In pagan times, protection against the hunt came from understanding and respecting its power, from performing the correct rituals and observances, from knowing the old ways. Under Christianity, protection came from faith in God and the intercession of the saints. You defended yourself against the hunt not by lying face down on the ground, but by making the sign of the cross. Not by leaving offerings at crossroads, but by saying prayers and carrying holy relics. Not by observing the ancient taboos, but by attending Mass and receiving the sacraments. The church also worked to replace the hunt in the cultural calendar. The wild riders had ridden primarily during the midwinter period, the time of Yule, when the barriers between worlds were thin. The church placed Christmas at this same time, transforming the season from a time of supernatural danger into a celebration of Christ's birth. Where once the darkest nights had belonged to Odin and his host, they now belonged to angels announcing peace on earth. The hunt was pushed to the margins, from the center of winter celebration to something that happened in the shadows, that people spoke of in whispers, if they spoke of it at all. But the transformation was never complete. Despite the church's best efforts, the hunt survived, though in altered form. In many regions, it split into different variations, each adapted to local circumstances and beliefs. In some areas, the hunt became explicitly Christian, led not by Odin or a demon but by a cursed Christian figure, a nobleman or knight who had committed some terrible sin and was now condemned to hunt eternally as punishment. This allowed the legend to continue while fitting it into the Christian framework of sin and penance. In other regions, the leader became ambiguous, no longer clearly identified as any particular figure but simply as the master of the hunt or the huntsman, a mysterious and frightening entity whose true nature was left deliberately vague. This ambiguity allowed people to maintain their belief in the hunt without explicitly endorsing a pagan or demonic interpretation. The hunt became a kind of floating signifier, a supernatural event that everyone acknowledged but that could be interpreted according to personal belief. The church's campaign against the hunt also had unintended consequences. By declaring it demonic, by associating it with Satan and hell, the church actually preserved the hunt's power to frighten. It remained a fearsome phenomenon, but now that fear was backed by the full authority of Christian theology. The hunt became a tool of social control, a way to keep people obedient and pious. If you strayed from the path of righteousness, if you failed to attend church or committed sins, you might be taken by the hunt, swept up into its demonic procession. This threat was particularly effective with children, and the hunt entered into the repertoire of cautionary tales used to enforce good behavior. Some local traditions found creative ways to incorporate both Christian and pagan elements. In parts of Germany, the hunt became associated with specific saints' days or church festivals, riding on the eve of important holy days. In these versions, the hunt served as a reminder of the spiritual significance of the coming celebration, a manifestation of the supernatural world's investment in Christian ritual. The hunters might even be interpreted as angels or souls in purgatory, beings that existed within the Christian cosmology but retained some of the wildness and danger of the older pagan version. The transformation of the wild hunt through Christianity is a perfect example of how folklore adapts and survives. The church had enormous power, both spiritual and temporal, to enforce its vision of reality. It could persecute heretics, burn witches, and suppress any belief it deemed contrary to doctrine. But even the church could not completely erase a belief as deeply rooted and widely held as the wild hunt. Instead, the legend changed, adapted, found new forms that could survive in the Christian world. It went underground, became more hidden, lost some of its original meaning, but it endured. The spectral riders continued to gallop through the winter night, even if those who saw them now understood them through a very different lens than their pagan ancestors had. The story of the wild hunt might have ended with its demonization by the church, fading gradually from memory as Europe modernized and rationalized. But instead, the legend experienced a remarkable renaissance in the 19th century, rescued from obscurity by a movement that valued the very things the Enlightenment had dismissed. The Romantic movement swept across Europe, bringing with it a passionate reverence for folklore, mythology, and the wisdom of the past. At the forefront of this movement were scholars like Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, whose collections of fairy tales are known worldwide, but whose broader work in folklore and linguistics was equally transformative. The brothers Grimm were part of a larger project of cultural nationalism that sought to define what it meant to be German, or Nordic, or Celtic, by looking not to the courts and churches but to the peasantry, to the folk traditions that had been passed down orally for generations. Jacob Grimm's monumental work Deutsche Mythologie, published in 1835, was the first comprehensive scholarly treatment of Germanic mythology and folklore. In it, Grimm devoted significant attention to the wild hunt, which he saw as a crucial survival of pre-Christian belief. He documented the various regional names for the hunt, the different leaders who were said to command it, and the elaborate folk practices associated with it. He connected the hunt to Norse mythology, to Odin, and argued convincingly that it represented a genuine memory of pagan worship that had survived over 1,000 years of Christian opposition. Grimm's work was revolutionary not because he discovered the wild hunt, which was already well known in folklore, but because he treated it seriously. He approached these stories not as superstitions to be mocked or demonic beliefs to be condemned, but as valuable cultural artifacts, windows into the spiritual lives of pre-Christian Europeans. He gave the hunt academic legitimacy, transforming it from peasant nonsense into a subject worthy of scholarly study. This academic interest in folklore coincided with a broader cultural movement. Romanticism celebrated emotion over reason, nature over civilization, the ancient over the modern. The wild hunt, with its primal power and its connection to a pre-Christian past, fit perfectly into this worldview. It became a symbol of authentic Germanic or Nordic identity, a link to a time when people lived closer to nature, when the gods still walked the earth, when magic was real and the universe was enchanted. Artists and writers embraced the hunt as subject matter. Painters depicted the spectral riders racing across storm-torn skies. Composers wrote music inspired by the hunt's chaotic energy, its suggestion of supernatural terror. Poets used it as a metaphor for fate, for death, for the unstoppable forces that govern human existence. The hunt entered into high culture, no longer merely a folk belief, but a recognized part of the European cultural heritage. The modern scholarly understanding of the wild hunt has become more nuanced and complex. While Grimm's connection between the hunt and Odin is still widely accepted, contemporary folklorists have added layers of interpretation. They see the hunt not as a simple survival of a single pagan belief, but as a complex phenomenon that absorbed influences from multiple sources over centuries. The historian Ronald Hutton, a leading authority on pagan Britain and folklore, has written extensively about the wild hunt. Hutton argues that while the hunt likely does have roots in pre-Christian belief, particularly in the mythology surrounding Odin, it also accumulated Christian, medieval, and early modern elements as it evolved. The hunt we know from the folklore collections of the 19th century is not a pure pagan survival, but a hybrid, a legend that has been shaped by many different hands over many generations. Hutton and others also point out that the hunt served different functions in different periods. In pagan times, it was likely primarily understood as a manifestation of divine power, Odin's ride, or a procession of the honored dead. In the medieval period, under Christian influence, it became a demonic phenomenon or a gathering of lost souls. In the early modern period, it was often interpreted as an omen of political or social upheaval. And in the Romantic period, it became a symbol of national identity and connection to an idealized past. The hunt has always been what people needed it to be, adapting to serve the psychological and cultural needs of each generation. Modern interpretations have also explored natural explanations for wild hunt sightings. Some scholars suggest that reports of the hunt may have been based on real phenomena that were misunderstood or mythologized. Storm clouds moving rapidly across the sky, particularly at night, can create shapes that might be interpreted as horses and riders, especially by observers who already believed in the hunt and were predisposed to see it. The sound of wind through trees or across valleys can create eerie howls and cries that might be mistaken for hounds or horns. Flocks of migrating birds, particularly geese, flying at night, can create sounds and visual effects that might contribute to hunt reports. These natural explanations do not necessarily diminish the legend. Even if some wild hunt sightings were based on misinterpretations of natural phenomena, that does not explain why the legend took the specific form it did, why it spread so widely, or why it persisted for so long. The power of the hunt lies not in whether spectral riders literally galloped across the sky, but in what the legend reveals about the people who believed in it, about their fears, their understanding of the universe, their relationship with death and the supernatural. The wild hunt has also found new life in contemporary paganism and neo-pagan movements. Modern practitioners of heathenry, the reconstructed Norse and Germanic paganism, often incorporate the hunt into their seasonal celebrations, particularly during the Yule period. For these practitioners, the hunt is not a frightening demon, but a sacred mystery, a connection to the gods of their ancestors. They may perform rituals honoring Odin as the hunt leader, or may invoke the hunt as a symbol of transformation, death, and rebirth. In popular culture, the wild hunt has become a widely recognized trope. It appears in fantasy literature, from the works of J.R.R. Tolkien to modern urban fantasy. It features in films, television shows, and video games, often as a moment of supernatural terror or as a dramatic manifestation of ancient power. These modern retellings take liberties with the original folklore, but they demonstrate that the core imagery of the hunt, spectral riders racing through the night, remains powerful and evocative even in the 21st century. The study of the wild hunt has also contributed to broader understanding of how myths and legends function in society. Folklorists use the hunt as a case study in several important concepts. It demonstrates syncretism, the blending of different religious and cultural traditions. It shows how beliefs can be reinterpreted and repurposed by successive cultures without losing their essential power. It illustrates the role of folklore in expressing collective anxieties and in providing frameworks for understanding frightening or inexplicable experiences. The hunt also serves as evidence for the incredible resilience of oral tradition. Despite centuries of opposition from both religious and secular authorities, despite mockery from the educated classes, despite the massive social and technological changes that transformed Europe from medieval to modern, the legend survived. It survived because it continued to resonate, because it addressed something fundamental about the human experience, our fear of death, our awareness of forces beyond our control, our need to find pattern and meaning in chaos. Today, scholars continue to study the wild hunt, adding new interpretations and discoveries. Archaeological evidence of ancient Germanic and Nordic religious practices provides context for understanding what the hunt might have meant to its earliest believers. Comparative mythology examines how similar legends appear in other cultures around the world, suggesting universal human responses to similar environmental and psychological pressures. Psychological and anthropological approaches explore why humans create and maintain belief in supernatural hunters and what these beliefs reveal about cognition, social structure, and cultural transmission. The wild hunt stands as one of the great success stories of folklore preservation. It survived the transition from oral to written culture. It survived religious opposition and scientific skepticism. It survived the mechanization of the world and the illumination of the night. And it survived because it was worth saving, because it contained truths about the human experience that could not be expressed in any other way, because the sound of hooves in the storm and the baying of spectral hounds still had the power to send a shiver down the spine, to remind us that the world is stranger and larger than our daily lives suggest, that beyond the light of our fires there are mysteries we have not yet solved and powers we do not yet understand.